you'll get the most points out of decisiveness and leadership. Okay, so now we're at the part on how the assessors are scoring you. So we looked at the probably eight or nine different performance dimensions. And so what the assessors do is in their training, they don't only review the exercises, but they look at what the performance dimensions are that you're being evaluated on. So like, for example, on a subordinate counseling, the assessors would look at oral communication, for example, right? And we'll look at what some scores would resemble on oral communication in just a minute. But for our assessments, here there will be a Likert type rating scale where they'll have points from 1 to 8, 1 to 7, or 1 to 6. And so at every one of those points, there's a definition of what kind of performance meets a particular point. Okay, so for example, we'll look at oral communications. So let's say you're presenting a crime action plan to a town hall meeting. Okay, and so one dimension that the assessors will look at is how effective are you at your oral communication. So the assessors would be given this rating scale, and so if they observe the behaviors on number 5, they would give you a 5. Okay, for example, if the candidate's verbal communication is consistently clear and concise and complete, the articulation of the language is distinct, you use a vocal variety of, let's say, voice inflection, different pitch, different speed, intonation, the assessors will give you a 5. If you're at ease with the use of gestures, your eye contact is good, you exhibit a high level of command bearing, and you don't use vocal fillers like you know, those are distractors. So to get a 5 on a town hall meeting scenario, if you exhibit all these, you'll merit a 5 on your score sheet. But let's say that you don't. Let's say that you do all these things on, let's go to 3, for example. Okay, so the assessors in their training would receive this, and they would be told that this is what defines a 3 on this rating scale. The candidate's verbal communication was understood, but contained detractors, such as limited frequency of vocal variety. Sometimes the candidate appeared nervous and unsure. The candidate was sometimes not clearly understood. The candidate's nervous mannerisms sometimes minimized the content of the presentation. In other words, it took away from how effective the presentation was. And then there was a notable number of vocal fillers. So when do people use vocal fillers? When they're probably unsure of themselves, maybe they want to take up some time, maybe they're still thinking, but you want to reduce and minimize that so you can score the higher point. Okay, so let's take a look at what a 2 or a 1 would be. Okay, so 1 is the candidate exhibited difficulty in expressing logical or reasonable thought patterns. So if you're unsure and you talk about a lesson plan or an action plan and it's not clearly developed, it's going to show as not being organized, not having a reasonable thought pattern. Here also, the candidate was not understood, and some comments were inconclusive. Speaking in a monotone voice. So not using a variety of vocal descriptors such as pitch, inflection, intonation. volume, speed. So as you look at these dimensions, quite a bit's expected of you. So also the candidate did not exhibit command bearing, or the candidate used police jargon and did not provide definitions of the terminology or the phrases, and then many vocal failures. So any questions on that so far? Okay, so the next part of this is the really the test preparation strategies. So this is something that will help you prepare for the assessment center. So these are also listed in the handout. The first thing you want to do is arrive early. If you get up late in the morning and you arrive late, it's going to create a lot of stress. I know that the doors were closed at a certain time, and so you want to certainly be there early. You'll have a time to prepare yourself emotionally and mentally, and you won't have to worry about finding a parking space or trying to run a red light or anything like that to get here on time. So it's always best to get an early start. The next thing is you want to prepare, and you're showing by your attendance here that you're interested in preparing. You're not taking this lightly. This is a very important assessment for you, and it's also important for the sheriff's office. So read the material, take some steps to practice. I'll also show you there's some content available on YouTube that you can look at, but you've got to vet that carefully because not everything that you see on YouTube is vetted. Okay. Understand the job responsibilities. So I took the liberty to look at the sergeant's job description, and so I wanted to highlight a couple of things that are very important. So on the job summary, so for sergeant, the job summary says supervises daily operations of assigned unit and ensures that laws, rules, and procedures are enforced. Participates in planning of programs, policies, or objectives for our own work group or department. And then so there are duties such as assisting or instructing other employees with their duties, a review of their work, conducting training to ensure personnel have the proper knowledge to do their jobs, assigning duties and plans work of others, participates in activities and duties related to emergency management. And there are others like the essential behavioral expectations. So Fort Bend County employees are expected to use professional courtesy, discretion, and sound judgment when engaging in any contact with coworkers, really any kind of stakeholder that you'll deal with. So that's an essential behavioral expectation, as well as doing things like maintaining confidentiality of business knowledge and employee information, maintaining professional relations while engaging in job-related tasks, and cooperating with others to resolve conflict. So you can look at the Fort Bend County job descriptions for sergeant, and that'll help you in your preparation as well. Okay, so moving along now on, say, familiarizing yourself with instructions and type of exercises. That handout that you have does quite a bit to tell you about the exercises, but also what dimensions you're going to be evaluated on for each of the exercises. Another thing that you can do is practice, practice, and practice. So some people will do things like video record themselves and then ask a subject matter expert to review that and give some constructive criticism. So that's a That's a good approach if you want to see how you appear on camera, how you appear to others, and how well you can perform under stress. Because these exercises will be a little stressful, but the more that you practice, the more you receive constructive criticism, the more likely you'll be to do a good job. The next item is to read books, peer-reviewed articles, and other assessment center publications. You can type assessment center in Google, and you'll come up with an abundance of literature. Just be selective on that. Read the abstract first to make sure it's something that could be a benefit to you. A lot of the articles that are there, especially the peer-reviewed, are good for scientific purposes and not really for your purposes. So read the abstract. If it provides you with recommendations, case studies, examples, tips and strategies, then that would be good. Another thing that you can do to prepare is study, supervision, and management books. The problem-solving book that you had, I think, is a good source. Obviously, you've already shown that you mastered some of the material. So look at those case studies, look at some examples, especially if they have to do with solving problems, solving crime, solving disorder. One thing that you definitely want to do is minimize any attempt to wing it, okay? Because you're going to be presenting before experienced assessors, and they won't be fooled by someone that's winging it. So make sure you practice and take an intelligent approach to this study. Assessors know when you're faking something, so be authentic. Do the best you can. I think the exercises that you have described for you there have the performance dimensions. Just look at those, read the dimensions and know how they're defined, and then act accordingly. Because the dimensions is how you're going to be evaluated, and the scores come based upon what you do, the behavior that you show in each one of those dimensions. Display confidence. This will be reflected in dimension like leadership, problem analysis and resolution. No one really knows if you're sweating or if you don't know it, so you want to appear confident, have a smile, have good command bearing, and you'll do well. Think aloud. The reason that's important is because many candidates have come before an assessment and they thought something but didn't say it. And so when they got their feedback or they got their grade, in some cases they're able to review video and they could tell, well, I thought about that, but I didn't speak it. I have to show behaviorally what I'm going to do on an exercise, and if you don't speak it, if you don't say it, you don't do it, you're not going to get credit for it. And then the last thing on this strategy or is to not make any assumptions. Okay, so the information that you receive as documents to the exercises will tell you exactly what you need to know. Review those carefully, and then develop your action plans. So these are a few other tips. You want to be clear and convincing. You're going to be judged on your action plan, how decisive you are on your action plan, and you want to be persuasive in it. If you can justify why you're doing something, you want to justify it. If you can state some background information, if you can determine a root cause of something, then you want to mention that. So the assessors like to see candidates that are decisive, that they have well thought out action plans, excuse me, and that they look at things like follow-up and consequences of not doing some action. Let's say that you're counseling a subordinate. you would want to do things like tell the subordinate what the consequences are of a failure to improve performance. Do your best, and do your best. That's all you can do, really. And so don't beat yourself up if you don't think you did so well on something. I can't tell you how many people have come out of an assessment and think that they've done so poorly, but they're number one on the list. I don't know how that happens, but it does. So don't beat yourself up if you don't think you've done your best. Seek outside advice and counsel. This would be someone that really knows what they're doing and not necessarily the person sitting next to you, because you guys are competing. Has anyone here been a supervisor before? Or has anyone worked for another agency as a supervisor? So if so, the reason I mention that is that if you've been a supervisor, you know the type of responsibilities that a supervisor has. One thing that you can do is look at what your supervisors are doing. What makes a good sergeant? You know, someone that's decisive, right? Someone that is easy to approach and talk to. Someone that has the knowledge and shows they have the skills and abilities and the right attitudes. That's what's expected of you. And so the last one I put on there is to observe your supervisor's behavior. You can usually tell if your supervisor has the traits and characteristics of what a supervisor should have, right? Are they approachable? Do they come up with viable plans? Do they consider new information? And so all those kind of things you would want to look at, and then you would want to emulate that yourself on these scenarios. So now, these are some of the ground rules for really all assessments. Is you'll be asked to sign a confidentiality statement that you're not going to release any of the information on the exercises, that you're not going to share the exercises with others, because I think this is going to be over a couple of days. One day you'll do 1 or 2 exercises, and then the next day you'll do 1 or 2 exercises. So electronic devices, including smartwatches, are not going to be allowed in the test site. So leave those at home. Now you can carry a stopwatch or a timer, because these exercises are going to be timed, okay? And so the proctors will probably keep you abreast of the time, but you can carry a watch. You may bring writing instruments. Attire for the assessment center is usually business attire. I don't think that you're prohibited from wearing your uniform, but is it okay, Sheriff, they can wear the uniform? Okay, so you can come dressed in business attire or your uniform. Okay, but remember, you're being evaluated on your command bearing, your leadership, and all these other dimensions. So you make sure that your uniform is clean, your shoes are polished, and that you have that level of command bearing. Okay, so once you arrive at the test site, you've got to remain. So no re-entry is allowed. So if you leave, you exit the test site, you won't be allowed back in. Now you can be escorted outside, let's say if you need to use the bathroom, that's always allowed. So there's an illness or an emergency, just follow the instructions that will be given to you. I know that there's an opportunity if you become ill to retest. I don't know that there's any contingencies made for that yet, though. And then finally, the test materials and everything must remain at the test site. Okay, so remember at the very beginning I mentioned that the assessment center has replaced the oral board interview. So the civil service rules under section 2, the competitive process for the promotional exams, that's the area where you'll find the information on the assessment center. So it talks about the content, the exercise types. It talks, excuse me, about the number of assessors. There's at least 3 and 1 alternate. The assessors have certain qualifications. They're supervisors and above. There's also a content on the civil service manual about the scoring and the recording. The performance indicators, that's just another word for the performance dimensions. And then ultimately, the eligibility list, you get 100 points for written test, up to 100 points for the assessment center. And then I think there's a combination of 6 and 8 points for education and your certification level. So any questions so far? Okay, so now I know that there was a question about where you could get more information. So these companies that are listed on this slide have all done assessment centers in this area. And some of these have sample exercises on the internet, on their websites. So this is one area where you could actually get some reliable information. So I mentioned earlier that there's some video on YouTube. So some candidates, I know at least one candidate from Houston that posted his personal videos on YouTube. So there's plenty of videos on sample exercises. But approach those with caution because you don't know if it's a good video recording or not. So the search terms on, say, a Google search can be any of the terms that we discussed earlier, whether it's a performance dimension or an exercise type. And then, so on the peer-reviewed articles, make sure that you read the abstract and see if that's something that's beneficial to you. And most of these are scientific and they don't really pertain to strategies or tips on how you can prepare. So here are a couple of sources as books, and these are all fairly recently published. You can probably find some of these in electronic format. This one here is a police assessment center. This one's a police promotion. This one's the assessment center handbook. And then police assessment center examination. So those are also listed on your handout. And then, so one thing that